Hello and welcome to today's webinar, The Enforcement Era Begins, live CMMC Roundtable presented by NeoSystems. I'm Don Carnevale, Director of Marketing at NeoSystems, and I'll be the moderator for today's event. If you have any questions during the presentation, you can enter them into the Q&A area within Zoom. We will have some time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions. Also, we will make the webinar recording and presentation slides available to all registrants in the coming days. Now, to get us started, I'd like to hand off to our host, Megan Kennett. Megan?
Thank you, Don, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. I'm Megan Kennett, CMMC Product Marketing Manager here at NeoSystems, and I'm honored to be the host of today's live roundtable. We do have a quick poll that we're going to go ahead and run just to gauge where everybody is on their CMMC journey. So we encourage you to go ahead and answer those questions, but I'll go ahead and continue with the moderating here. So today's session is all about helping you navigate life post November the 10th and what we're calling the enforcement era. What's real, what's noise, and perhaps most critically, what do you need to do before someone asks you where your SSP is and why it looks like it was written during the Reagan administration? We want this to be interactive, useful, and actionable. So if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. We'll get to as many as we can, and anything we miss, we'll follow up on afterward. So joining me today are two of the sharpest minds I know, and more importantly, people who live and breathe this stuff every day. First up, welcome David Carlino, NeoSystems Senior Vice President and Chief Information Security Officer. David brings over a decade of experience building and securing systems from scrappy startups to enterprises. He leads our product development efforts with one hand, and with the other ensures our big ideas don't violate the laws of physics, logic, or NIST 800-171. Also with us is Ed Bassett, NeoSystems Chief Security Evangelist. Ed is the guy you bring in when you want more than just a regulation recited back to you. He'll tell you what it means, where it comes from, and what's going to break first if you ignore it. He's helped countless contractors and clients turn, we should probably do something about that one day, into real measurable security maturity. If David gives you the strategy, Ed gives you the straight talk, with just enough tough love to keep your POAM short and your audit trail clean. Welcome, Ed. Next slide, please. All right. Here's what we've got lined up for today. No fluff, just the stuff that matters. We'll run through the current state of CMMC, then we'll hit the highlights of the DoD FAQs and NIST updates. And then it's time for the CMMC Roundtable. So we'll wrap up with some Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions now so we can incorporate them into our roundtable coming up shortly. All right. Okay, so we've got a couple responses back from the poll. So we've got, do you have CUI? 2% don't know. The rest are 75% yes. Contract requirement. All right, this is good information. So we've got a lot of level 2 self-assessments and level 2 C3PAOs. So that's great to know. Thank you all for participating in this. And it looks like we've got some great current state CMMC status. So, all right. Not sure I want to, all right, so we'll move on to the next slide. All right, so this whole CMMC thing is real. And yes, enforcement is actually here. I know, we're all shocked. In other news, water continues to be wet. With phase 1 underway, let's set the stage with a quick update on where things stand. So in September, the 48 CFR rule cleared OIRA, making the CMMC program the law. And as of November 10th, phase 1 of enforcement has been in full effect. Now, instead of drowning you in regulatory jargon, you're looking at the 5 DFARS clauses that matter the most. So what does this mean for our GovCon community? As of November 10th, this year, contractors will primarily start seeing solicitations requiring either a level 1 self-assessment or a level 2 self-assessment with a passing score posted in SPRS as a condition of award. So these are there are exceptions, and I think we are all seeing where program managers and primes are requesting a level 2 C3PAO certification, but we're not considering that the norm. And I don't think the DoD is either. If you want the contract, you need the passing score in SPRS. It's really that simple in phase 1. So that's the playbook. That's where the mandates live. Next slide, please, Don. In other news, let's take a look at what else has happened in the world of cybersecurity. First, the DoD released a surprisingly helpful updated CMMC FAQ with some of the most significant clarifications being on the topics of encrypted CUI and how it is still CUI, regardless of how you dress it up, with full protection required. So if it was CUI before encryption, congratulations, it's CUI after encryption. They talked and clarified the difference between a POAM and an operational plan of action, how MSSPs are ESPs and must be assessed as part of the contractor's boundary, even if they don't touch CUI. And they provided some clarification on VDI endpoints and how they can be out of scope, but with the strict server-side configuration. They also discussed some NIST Rev 3 implementers or addressed NIST Rev 3 implementers and how they must use DoD's ODPs. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to you, David. Would you mind walking us through the recent updates on media sanitization and the formal guidance on ODPs and why it matters now?
Yeah, for everybody who keeps up with all the NIST special publication 800 series, you're probably already well ahead of the game. For those of you that don't, one of the requirements around media sanitization has been updated. That control calls out to this NIST special publication 888, which has had a revision update. It's on revision 2. There's some new purge methods in there that are worth taking a look at. So for any organization that's kind of struggling with how do I destroy CUI data, especially in a logical format, that one's worth taking a look at. There's some important changes in there. Just wanted to keep everybody up to date on it. For the DoD ODPs, these are organization-defined parameters. The guidance that we've been getting around the NIST 800-171 standard is that it had departed from the original FISMA design on purpose. They moved away from FISMA and the sort of the way that NIST 853, which is the original control Bible, if you will, when they selected the controls for NIST 800-171, they also made a decision to move it a little bit away from the structure of 853. 853 has these defined parameters in them. With the revision 3, the DoD is formally saying they're moving back closer to the NIST 853 design. NeoSystems supports that. We think that's a great idea. Maintaining closer compliance between the two standards is typically better for everybody, so we're happy to see this. But the parameters are, in this case, often not set by the organization, but going to be set by the DoD. So the actual selections they want you to be at or above are in this list. It's useful now for anybody keeping an eye on revision 3. It's also useful now to understand how it might apply to your current revision 2, CMMC level 2 efforts. The parameters they're defining are worth taking a look at in terms of how often to do some things, what your specific settings should be around inactivity timeout and things like that. So well worth following up on. Digging into. We'll be keeping an eye on the Rev 3 changes as time goes on, and hopefully you guys are too.
I want to add a little bit of news that just came out from DoD on this. I mean, they on the one hand, they've published these ODP guidance for Rev 3. On the other hand, they've said we're going to stick with Rev 2 for CMMC for now, right? So for customers that are trying to juggle that and trying to decide how do they build their system, especially companies that are maybe new to government contracting, building their first system, they obviously would want to build to the newest standard instead of going through 2 compliance cycles. And so the DoD has addressed this in some recent blog posts that they put out, and they've talked about the fact that right now you have to get your assessment for CMC done under Rev 2, but you might want to build to Rev 3. And right now it's sort of this manual process of the customer or each contractor has to make sure that they don't have any gaps on Rev 2. So it's very possible to build a system that's compliant with both Rev 2 and Rev 3. but there's definitely some extra paperwork involved. So you build to Rev 3, but you have to demonstrate Rev 2 compliance for CMMC purposes. And DoD has said that they're working on some guidelines there on how to assess systems that were built to Rev 3 under the current rule. It's going to take them a while. They have to do a rulemaking change to make Rev 3 active. So they've said they're working on it. That's good. For now, it's still some manual work if you want to go down that path. But it's very good to know that DoD is trying to help out the forward thinkers among us, right? Those who want to build to the latest standard.
Fantastic. All right. Thank you so much for color and clarification. Next slide, please. All right. So we're getting closer to the roundtable. We're going to talk we're going to share some questions that we received recently, and we're going to dive right into those, the roundtable discussion. So, all right, let's go ahead and move to the next slide. Okay. Question number 1, over to you, David. What is the impact of the transition from DoD DIBCAC to Cyber AB assessor-led assessments?
So for anybody that went through DoD DIBCAC assessments, which are still ongoing, there are still mandatory DIBCAC assessments for some people. So some of you may be still facing DIBCAC assessment. The DIBCAC assessment model, it's from the DoD. It's very methodic. It's repetitive. Each time you go through one, they do the same order. They do a good job at structure. It's definitely effective in the way that they approach it. I would not say, though, that it has all of the window dressings and additive type things that we're seeing with the C3 PAOs, who are, for-profit organizations and want to do the best they can to differentiate from their, competitors in their market. The DIBCAC doesn't have competitors in its market. So while I think they do an excellent job, it's a very different experience. It's much more, to a schedule, follow these rules 8 hours a day, kind of cover everything in this point blank way. We've seen the C3 PAOs each adopting a little bit of different approaches. Some assessors send out these 8-hour blocks, just like DIBCAC. Some send out more scheduled meetings. Some stick to the, control 311 and then 312 and the same way DIBCAC did. Others have, a different approach to it. So one, we see a lot more just helpful scheduling, communication, getting out in front of things, just kind of the better administrative wrapping is coming with the C3 PAO assessments. And we tend to see that they're a little more familiar with our technology builds, advanced technology builds especially. So still not unhappy with how DIBCAC does it, but I do think that the C3 PAO process, they are getting more and more information from Cyber AB about how to interpret gray area. I think they're seeing a lot more builds. They're getting better at being able to interpret and read through the system security plans quicker.
Excellent. Thank you, David. And then I think this question we've gotten multiple times. Number 2, how do I know if I'm ready to schedule my third-party assessment? And how do I know if I'm compliant?
Yeah, and this one is the most common question that NeoSystems gets, and our answer is pretty much always the same. If you don't know for sure that you're ready, you are not ready. The point of going through a CMMC assessment is to prove something that you should already feel very confident of because of your own security program, because of your own continuous monitoring and applying a risk management framework. So the observable state of compliance should be something that you've already attained. You might have some gray area questions around, is my printer gonna pass? Is it a design that works? And that's a fair question because not everything has been settled into, a precedent with CMMC yet. So you might be confident that you've done everything to your plan, and you might still have some question with your assessor. Will they assess this as a pass? That's one thing. But if you're not otherwise looking at this list of all the 110 controls and 320 assessment objectives with a high level of confidence that all of your evidence is ready and that you will pass, you're really not in the best position to be going up to assessment. And that's for a couple reasons. It's not how it's supposed to work. This is not supposed to be a hope and a prayer. It is supposed to be an ongoing implementation of a well-managed and thought-out system security plan with change control and continuous monitoring. That kind of effort takes intention. So if you can't kind of point to all the intentional places and evidences you've gathered up for confidence, you're probably not ready to go through the third-party audit. You might be in a compliant state, but going through audit means showing, maybe 1,000 pieces of evidence to an assessor in a really clean, succinct way. And that, being at that position, having done that once is a good idea.
I think Megan mentioned, that a lot of the emphasis in phase one is on self-assessment, right? Not everybody needs a C3PAO assessment. I think a lot of people are focused on that because it's a big milestone, obviously. And there's other reasons that Megan mentioned, other than the contract requirements, pressure from your primes, whatever. But I think, the self-assessment plays a big role in this answering this question of knowing that you're ready. The self-assessment process is quite rigorous, and I guess my advice is, make sure you're following that guidance from the DoD, the NIST 800-171 Alpha. You're following that guidance to the T when you're doing a self-assessment. And if that's something that, if your affirming official and the staff that they have available is not comfortable with, get some help from it, right? It could be your MSP partner, it could be a consultant, but there's someone who's going to do that self-assessment. Even though self doesn't necessarily have to be done by the affirming official personally, right? So typically they're going to have somebody that they know and trust. But ideally, you should get to a score that you believe in, a score that you trust, and so you have that high level of confidence, as David mentioned, that you've really looked at every single piece of required evidence for every single assessment objective. That's no more, the self-assessment process is as rigorous as the C3PAO process. So if you can pass that, you shouldn't have any problem, right? If you had a comfortable experience and looking at the evidence yourself, showing it to a third party should be similarly comfortable. Some people do kind of gloss over the self-assessment, and that's where I think you can get in trouble, where you feel like you feel like you're compliant and you're not. And I've heard this from a lot of C3PAOs that they talk to customers all the time that say, I'm ready, let's contract, let's do this thing. And they get in there and ask a handful of questions and realize they're very far from ready. So I think the best way to do that is take some of those preliminary steps seriously. The gold standard, obviously, I think, David mentioned, the gold standard for readiness validation is get a mock assessment from the same C3PAO that's going to do your real assessment. That's the gold standard, but it's not a cheap endeavor, and it's a poor way to learn things, right? So you don't even want to do that until you have a pretty high level of confidence. Again, they're going to charge you money, and they can't give you advice. So you don't want to do it as a way to figure stuff out, right? You should figure it out ahead of time with your MSP partners and consultants and other people you have available.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that, the mock assessment or readiness assessment process is perfect if you believe you're going to pass, but you've got some gray area concepts, things that you can't find on the internet, you can't seem to get out of a C3PAO. Is this design that we're putting forward, has somebody else used it? Is it compliant? I mean, we believe it's compliant. We've done all the stuff, we've written our documents, but some of these interpretations still come down to your judge and jury, your C3PAO. So contracting with the C3PAO you intend to use for an audit, to do a mock assessment or readiness assessment. Again, you want to believe you're ready and done. You should have all the evidence to show it, but the mock assessment or readiness assessment is very helpful for companies that are kind of in this gray area. We think we're doing something that's allowed, but it's not quite clear.
100%. That's great. A great point, David. Thank you for adding that. All right. So number 3, Ed, if you're okay taking this one or starting off with this one, and of course, we can add color commentary.
Sure. I think, assessments we've just been talking about, right? They're a point in time validation of your compliance status, where they come in, it happens in a few days. A lot of folks right now are very focused on making sure they pass that first assessment, whether it's a self-assessment or a C3PAO assessment. And that's a pretty worthy milestone, right? I celebrate after achieving that milestone. But it's really important as you're thinking about your CMMC journey to stay very focused on maintaining that compliance over time. So CMMC requires that the affirming official affirm continuous compliance. That doesn't mean it requires the affirming official to pass the assessment. It means continuous compliance forever. And of all the things required under CMMC, configuration management is the most challenging thing. I mean, of all the 110 requirements that we see in NIST 800 171, that configuration management family is the hardest for most people. It's a discipline that has to operate every day. It has to work even during outages, incidents, and emergencies, right? So we can't bypass it. Sure, in an emergency, we might adjust the timelines. We might implement first and document later, but we still have to maintain configuration control of all the assets in the CMMC scope at all times. So that's, it's a challenging thing. So that I think the number one way to maintain compliance is to take those requirements very seriously, really bake in configuration management tools and processes into every aspect of your IT service delivery, right? So whether you're doing that delivery yourself or you have a MSP that's doing the delivery on your behalf, make sure that stuff is well configuration managed, and not just, I get a request, somebody fulfills the request. You have to go through that configuration management process. I think another key aspect of maintaining compliance that is often overlooked or maybe minimized is continuous monitoring. So, people think of that requirement from the NIST standard and they think about the SIEM tool that's used by their MSSP, right? So monitoring logs 24/7 in the SOC, and they say, hey, it's continuous and it's monitoring. Well, yes, it is, and that is part of the answer. But ConMon, as required by the 800 171 standard, is much larger. It must assess the continued effectiveness of every other control, the other 109. So if you do it correctly, those ConMon activities are going to detect and correct any errors and omissions that you have in your configuration management practices, in your access authorization practices, in your training, personnel screening, like anywhere where you might have slip ups in your security program. If you're doing continuous monitoring well, it's going to detect that. So, even the best process, most well-designed, good automation, still can drift or fail once in a while. And that's why the continuous monitoring requirement exists. Recognizes that sort of frailty of the things we build and human behavior, and says, let's make sure we detect those things and correct them timely. So if you're detecting a failure during an assessment, during maybe a C3PO assessment would be the worst. If you're detecting that failure during, say, an annual assessment that the affirming official does, it's probably too late. Like, that's a bad time to find that. You should find that during continuous monitoring. So I think, yeah, two things: configuration management, take it very seriously. Continuous monitoring, make sure you've covered all the other 109 controls, that you're monitoring everything. Not 24/7, right? Some things get monitored 24/7. Some things get looked at periodically. The NIST standard on continuous monitoring talks about that. You got to choose a frequency that's appropriate for the thing you're monitoring.
Yeah, and that's a
Excellent.
big part of how we deliver our programs to people. So anybody who is working with us, we regularly reach out to talk about these scheduled activities. Risk assessment is an annual activity. Reviewing your configurations is one of the ones where, maybe you do it more often if you're a complex environment. Maybe you do it less often if you're a simpler environment, in the sense, maybe if we're just using Intune for workstations and just a handful of them, configurations don't change much. Maybe your ConMon schedule for configuration review is a little more relaxed than a company who's very dynamic and sees a lot of configuration change. So
Sure.
there's
Or
room in
maybe
the standard to define your ConMon schedule, but it should be complementary to the complexity of your environment, as Ed's saying. So you find mistakes quickly, or in a reasonable amount of time where drift might have occurred.
the important thing is that you don't need to stomp it out and not have any drift, right? That's not the definition of compliance under CMMC. It's that what David said, that you detect it and correct it in a timely fashion. You're allowed to have operational plan of actions. We'll talk about that, I think, a little later. So you're allowed to have things go wrong and still be considered compliant. If you don't notice that it went wrong and you don't fix it, now you're having a compliance failure.
Great points. Great points. All right. Lastly, I think this one, I'd like to go ahead and tee this one up to you, Ed. How do dynamic, rapidly growing companies keep their CMMC compliant current?
Great question. I mean, CMMC static, right? You submit a fixed scope, you get a point in time assessment of that scope. If you're doing a self-assessment, it's a year. If you're doing a C3PO, it's 3 years. How many of us think our company and our IT is not going to change in 3 years? I hope it changes, or else we're probably building up tech debt and stagnating, right? So this question really gets to the heart of the CMMC rules about managing change. Once you've submitted a CMMC assessment scope, a score, CMMC assessment score for a particular scope, any significant change to that scope requires a new assessment. So if you're changing your system every day, do we need to bring the C3PAO back in on a daily basis? Hopefully not, right? So, but it's also not reasonable to think that you're not going to have changes happen, within that time period. So the trick there is to really focus on in your configuration management processes, in your assessment scope design, like as you choose to say, what is my scope? Think about how that's going to change over time, the growth trajectory and path of your company. Anticipate that and bake some of that in, right? Define what is a significant change to the CMMC assessment scope that would require reassessment, either by you or by the C3PAO, and define what is a normal expected operational change. So, some things are, of course, not a significant change. I have 10 laptops, I'm going to add an 11th laptop, now I have 11 laptops. Not a significant change. You don't need a reassessment to do that. But what about other kinds of changes that might be a little more impactful? If you've anticipated those and you describe them in your SSP, you describe them in your configuration management processes, and that gets assessed, then you're allowed to carry out those changes without it being considered a significant change. So I would say, yeah, if you look in your configuration management plan and it's not clear what's significant and what's not, then take a look at that. If you look at the guidance from the DoD and the regulation on CMMC, it talks about the significant change. It gives some examples of what would be considered a significant change, but it's not a terribly good definition. It's not very specific. So ultimately, the decision of what is and isn't a significant change comes down to each individual contractor, right? You have to read the law, interpret it as it applies to your system, and decide of all the changes you're going to make, which ones are significant, which ones are not. I have heard from companies, for instance, that are doing like rapid acquisitions, where their growth path involves acquiring other companies that come with their own IT system. So these companies have a scope that's changing in sort of unknown ways. They don't know what company they're going to buy or what kind of IT they're going to have, whether it will be compliant the day they buy it or they have to bring it into compliance, whether they're going to roll them in to this larger scope they already have. Those companies that I've talked with, they're doing arrangements with the C3PAO, recognizing that they're going to need to see that C3PAO more than once every 3 years. So they're working on a deal with the C3PAO that says, I know I'm going to be acquiring these companies. I know I'm going to need reassessment for significant change. Let's come up with a plan of action for handling that, right? Let's make sure we have a strategy for doing that. So that minimizes their cost, right? So they're not starting from scratch, from fresh every time they do an acquisition, especially if they're doing one every 2 months or one a quarter, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I want to back up a little bit on a couple things Ed was saying there. There is a concept under CMMC of reassessment, and it's not, CMMC is pretty new. We're just starting the enforcement era. So as we get into this, we will see companies like Ed's describing that are dynamic, they're changing, and the rules basically say if you change too much, you have to go back through an assessment. There's not any stipulation for a partial assessment where you can just assess what maybe changed. The rules today say if you're significant enough and you call this a quote significant change because of what happened, you've moved from Microsoft to Google. You have a completely different system security plan and approach. This would call for reassessment because your information system no longer looks like the plan and the point in time thing you presented to the Defense Department or to your C3PAO. So with that in mind, there is a significant change requirement. Dynamic and rapidly growing companies are going to butt up against that, but there's not much precedent yet for exactly what that means. Assessors are, like Ed said, pointing it back to you to say, write a plan, document what the impact of this change is, where it impacts your security and compliance posture, and make a decision if you feel that it fits the CMMC definition. It's certainly something you can discuss with your assessor. If you've already gone through assessment, nothing wrong with that. But they too will say, I hear you. It's going to be on your affirming official because of your system security plan to communicate to us a defensible position of whether or not this is one, how you made the decision, and two, what your actual decision was. So if you make a policy that says we're going to define significant change as something completely unacceptable, that wouldn't fly. So most assessors point you toward, the NIST documentation and the risk management framework, NIST 837. Um, these NIST publications being third party, well researched from the NIST organization, that's a great place to hang your hat. So for our customers, we point into that standard. We talk about significant change in your configuration management plan, and we help you each time you're making changes to do configuration change control, evaluate the impact of the change and help understand if this, major or high impact change is really in fact significant and will call for reassessment.
Awesome. All right, let's move on to the next one. Are the CMMC program rules changing? There's been a lot of updates over the past, I don't know, several months to a year. David, would you like to take this one?
Yeah, I like this question because are the rules changing? Depends on how you define change. In a practical sense, what you have to do is changing. The rules themselves are not changing. So there's a kind of a mismatch here. The rules themselves, they've put them down, they've approved them. The interpretation, setting precedent, the concept of, for us in the US common law, the concept of each situation is judged by its situational facts, and that we've settled on this concept that assessors are going to be given discretion over compliance in the gray area. They are, as noted, much like your judge and jury in that respect. They are beholden to a set of standards that the Defense Department has published, rules that are not changing. However, as they encounter various implementation gray areas, the Cyber AV is continuing to publish to the C3PAO community, the assessor community, clarifications about how to interpret or what the driving interpretation should be for them as they make these discretion decisions. That's helping a ton. Those kinds of building in precedent, establishing where the assessors should be, and continuing to make sure that each assessment looks and feels like the last one, whether it was from company A or company B. That is their goal. So the rules, no, they're not changing, but the clarifications that are coming out and the precedent that's being set by all these assessments that are going on is starting to put in place a body of case law and precedent that assessors are really using to help to clarify how to interpret. So if you did an assessment last May with DIBCAC, the final rule wasn't out yet. The CMMC final rule wasn't out yet. So would that assessment have been under a different rule set than now? Certainly. But since the CMMC final rule has come out, now that we're in this enforcement era, the rules are pretty well set for the C3PAOs. It's the interpretation, the precedent, the case law that's driving practical change for how to implement particular controls and meet particular rules.
Yep, absolutely. And I think there's a large community of cybersecurity enthusiasts, if you call them. Those of us that are really passionate about securing the DIB are continuing to push for greater cybersecurity standards. I know the MSP Collective, I'm a part of, I'm on the board of, that's part of our mission. And I know there's a lot of great other groups out there that are also asking for clarification. So I think we'll continue to see that. And I think it's been refreshing, especially with everything live now. The more clarification, the better. And so thank you, David, for that.
To tack on with that, the significant change concept, as we just noted, we're just getting people through their first assessment. How exactly we're going to interpret significant change against reassessment, we haven't quite gotten there. There's not many companies that have had to do it. The assessors aren't super familiar. So while the rules won't change, I would expect that significant change, its definition continues to get clarification. If we look to FedRAMP as the big brother to CMMC, significant change under the FedRAMP program has a really prescriptive definition. If you do any of the following, consider it a significant change. So I wouldn't be surprised if CMMC can get to some of those, known types of significant change. But for the most part, again, the CMMC model is much more based on discretion for the third-party assessors who are expected to learn your system for you, given the breadth of types of systems that you see in the defense community.
All right, moving on to number 6. There's been a lot of online chatter that primes will require their subs and suppliers to achieve level 2, regardless of CUI, whether they maintain, manage that. Is there any truth to this?
The primes do whatever they want. I mean, they're a company, right? So they can use their legal team and push down contract the way they want to with the people who they supply to. There is still the standards that the DoD puts forward. But we have seen some, primes say we want for companies to achieve this bar, and a different prime will set a different bar and a different bar. So certainly there are different types of contracts that come out of the prime. Some of them maybe are actually in a higher category for them, and that might be opaque to you, their sub. So are we seeing subs pushing out various goals or saying, hey, we want you to achieve a standard? Yes. Is there any rhyme or reason to it? Not right now. I'm sure the companies that are doing it have clear reasons, but to a lot of the third parties like us as an external service provider, and to a lot of subs and suppliers, it's not entirely clear where the bar is with the primes, and we do see that changing over time. I don't think there's anything malicious going on from the primes perspective. They want to be ahead of this game because they have really robust standards they need to meet. So I'm not saying anything is wrong here, but there is varied requirements among primes that they flow down to the sub community.
And the primes are trying to defend their supply chain, right? I mean, they're at risk of maybe losing an award if they have a gap in their supply chain because one of their critical suppliers is not ready. So they're being really proactive about making sure that folks are ready, and that includes this thing you're talking about, David, right? That they're telling them, hey, I want you to get level 2 capabilities, even if today you don't handle any CUI. I can't take the risk later as a prime. I can't take the risk that a contract requires me to pass CUI to you, and you tell me, hey, I need 12 to 18 months to build out my IT system. I mean, that's the typical lead time to become compliant. So if you got a supplier that says, hey, this doesn't apply to me, I don't need to do this, so they don't, and then some future contract requires it, it's a 12 to 18-month lead time. If the prime can't wait that long, their only other option is to find another supplier at the last minute that can do all the services and is compliant. So I think they're being defensive, right? They need to defend their ability to deliver on the contracts. So they need a robust supply chain. So they're asking a lot of times just to build a capability. And I think the best path to a sub that's in that position where you don't have CUI, but your prime is telling you you have to get certified, is to build out a small enclave, right? Some IT system, an information system that is capable of handling CUI, and that establishes the capability, lets you demonstrate compliance and get certified on a small scale. And then you can expand that system as your needs change, right? As that prime wins contracts, they award work to you, and maybe they do flow down some actual CUI, then you expand the system to do it. And with cloud computing, NeoSystems, we've got the ability to build and operate these enclaves at a very, very small scale. We can build an enclave for one user, and commensurate cost, fairly low cost. So for contractors that are merely in that sort of getting ready stage, right, satisfying a demand from their prime, but not handling CUI today, rather than argue with the prime about why you don't need it, get the capability, be the prime or the subcontractor that's stepping up and demonstrating the capability, and let's hope that grows into some more business, and maybe then there is some CUI there.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with volunteering for CMMC assessment. A lot of external service providers that do not handle CUI data, they don't necessarily have to get CMMC compliant based on the ruling in the CMMC final rule. ESPs that do not handle CUI data. However, if you're close to security protection data or you're right on that line around security protection, most companies are going to want you to do CMMC level 2. And for the most part, it's the easiest answer for most companies to say they are CMMC level 2 compliant as an external service provider. So there's a lot of use cases, brand new companies that have not signed a contract, they don't have CUI yet. but they're going to put in place, a system that can handle this data once they get it. So it's perfectly normal to go through assessment with no CUI yet. In my opinion, it's almost easier because you're not yet under the gun for a contractor who's telling you must store the data from the contract this way or that. You're in a little bit more of a proactive, write your own plan. And I think Ed had a great point earlier when he was talking about dynamic and rapidly growing companies. Companies that you may one day print and store CUI data. If you're in that kind of position, and you're about to go through an assessment as an enclave, a virtual enclave with no printing involved, if you add a facility and you add printing and you change this boundary, you're likely going to have to reassess. So while you can plan an enclave build as a small company with no CUI, it is important to also, don't shoot yourself in the foot. Be smart about your actual expected use case when you do get CUI. Design your system security plan authorization boundary to it so that you don't audit something that, a couple months later when you finally win the contract, you immediately have to go through reassessment with a significant change.
Yeah, forward thinking definitely pays off. And as we talked about earlier, right, those rules are evolving still. So, plan ahead. Assessments are expensive. Planning ahead could be a lot cheaper. Think through what those requirements might be and bake that into your CMMC scope that you take through assessment.
Great questions. And I think that was our last one on that slide. And we can move on to the next one. But before we jump into our final Q&A, I'd like to give everybody a quick picture of how NeoSystems is helping the DIB right now, because a lot of what we're talking about ties directly into the work we do every day, especially as we're navigating this enforcement era together. So if you're new to NeoSystems, we've been in this space for over 23 years, serving nonprofits and government contractors across the country. This is the world we live in: compliance, contracts, cybersecurity, the messy reality of keeping operations moving while meeting federal requirements. And for CMMC specifically, our focus is pretty simple: give contractors an accelerated, affordable, low-risk path to compliance without forcing them to become their own IT or compliance department in the process. So bringing that to our next topic, that's really where our base and our frame solutions come in. So NeoSystems Base is a fully managed Microsoft 365 environment built for protecting CUI. You get the secure workspace, the user device management, the documentation, the 24/7 SOC monitoring, all the heavy lifting that takes the risk and guesswork out of DIY compliance. And then Frame is designed for your business application. So like Dell Tech CostPoint, legacy apps hosted in a FedRAMP authorized environment powered by Azure. So you get the security, the compliance you need without maintaining on-prem servers or building out hosting infrastructure. So, and I'll add this: we are CMMC Level 2 certified ourselves. So we're not asking anyone to do anything that we haven't done. We know what it takes, where the challenges are, and we built these services to meet contractors wherever they are in their journey. All right, with that quick overview out of the way, let's get into the questions.
All right, Megan. So we have had a few questions come in, so I'll just go ahead and run through these one at a time. The first one is, with Windows 10 reaching end of support, do we need to upgrade to Windows 11 to stay compliant?
It's a pretty straightforward one. Yes. For any device that you want to authorize for CUI handling, the expectation is that it is a device that you can update and patch if a vulnerability comes out. So what Microsoft says, they're no longer going to provide security updates to the Windows 10 platform. What that means is attackers are going to go on inventing and discovering ways to hack or exploit that operating system, and you have no way to patch anymore. So you will no longer be able to meet a series of controls that talk to secure development lifecycle, secure baseline. There are business use cases where people will still have to continue to use Windows 10. There are all kinds of reasons why that might occur. The trick is for all things in compliance to document your intention, your business justification, your security impact. So we must continue to use Windows 10 because we built firmware for a satellite and we're required by the government to keep this Windows 10 machine in this exact state forever. So if we ever have to touch up again, we have it exactly the same system. That's a common request. So these kinds of freeze it in time, you might have that requirement for whatever you build, that you don't upgrade it, you put it away, you keep it. Justify that, document it. But for 99% of people, once Windows 10 is end of life and it no longer gets security updates, um, you won't be in a position to say you're using secure technology. You'll fail on a couple controls there.
All right. Thank you,
Thank you,
David.
David.
I'm sorry, Megan. The next question is, for phase one of the CMMC rollout, how do we receive a self-certificate?
I mean, you submit a self-assessment score, and you can get, you can show proof of that to someone, right? The government can see that in there. So if you're bidding on a contract, the government can see it. If you're a subcontractor and you're not bidding directly, you can, show a screenshot of that to the people you need to demonstrate it to. But yeah, it's all done through the SPURS system.
Yep. The self-assessments, once you submit your self-assessment, you will receive a CMMC unique identifier or UID. So you want to maintain that and use that going forward. And that's how the DoD is going to associate you with your system.
Yeah, and this is all done through the PIEE system. When you go to the Supplier Performance Risk System, the SPURS system, you're going to put in your SPURS score. At that time, when you put your score in, you state which system security plan version you were using for your self-assessment. You attest to that score formally, and you get the unique identifier that Megan was noting. Once you've done all those things in your SPURS portal, it'll say self-attestation as compared to a third-party attestation from a C3PAO or the DIBCAC attestation. So you can grab a screenshot of that. You can use your ID when you're submitting to new contract bids. But you don't get like a formal certificate the same way that you do for a third-party assessment.
One thing I want to definitely note is the emphasis on that unique identifier, right? That's an information system identifier, not a company identifier, right? So your company is identified by cage codes and other things, right? So
Right.
that identifier that Megan mentioned is for the information system. And when you bid on a contract, you have to say which information system or systems, could be multiple, are going to be used in the performance of that contract. And those have to be certified. So it's not about getting certified as a company level. It's about getting certified, or excuse me, about assessing individual information systems. You may have one, you may have several, and keeping track of which ones are being used on which contracts if you have multiple, right? So some companies have gotten in trouble for that, where they get a system assessed, they have a score, they represent that that's the system they're using, but actually they're using some different system that's not been assessed in performance of the contract. That's a big no-no, right? So it is on the information system level.
Okay, next question is, can you describe the relationship of an MSP and an RPO under the same roof, particularly the pros and cons of this scenario?
So the RPO was, registered provider organization. It was initially, when CMMC first came out, it was kind of a indicator of alignment, right? You could go, your company, if you're an MSP, you could go get an RPO designation. It was a registration, not a certification, so there was no vetting process per se. But you registered and you sort of demonstrate that I'm aligned with CMMC. I'm on board. I'm with the program. And so, companies would use that as a way to express the expertise of the organization. And under that, they would have some, registered practitioners, some people on their staff, one or more, who, have been registered as CMMC practitioners. Nowadays, I think that's less of a valuable indicator. So still valuable, right? If you're working with an MSP and you ask them, hey, are you an RPO or do you have other CMMC credentials? That's an indicator of alignment, that they know what CMMC is all about. But the much stronger note of alignment today is, have they been CMMC level 2 certified? So as Megan mentioned, NeoSystems as an MSP that services this market, we've gone out and gotten our CMMC Level 2 certification for the information systems that we use to supply those services. And it's not required. We don't have to do it because we don't have CUI, but we do it because we do it for many reasons. But one is to indicate our alignment with those requirements. Megan, I think you mentioned the MSP Collective, so you could check out the mspcollective.org website. It's a nonprofit industry group that has a directory of CMMC Level 2 certified MSPs that you can select from. And I'll say that of the multiple hundreds of thousands of MSPs in the country, in the world, only about 24 of them have been certified at this point, right? So these are the MSPs that have aligned with CMMC, made the commitment. So I'll give a plug for the nonprofit there, even though they didn't pay for this webinar. mspcollective.org. Check out that directory as you're trying to choose your MSP partners.
Okay, the next question is, can you accomplish CMMC compliance with a Microsoft 365 cloud-only infrastructure?
Yes, you can. The Microsoft GCC or GCC High environments are certified for controlled unclassified data. The CMMC final rule makes explicit that you can have a virtual desktop infrastructure or VDI infrastructure. Microsoft offers the Windows 365 cloud PCs, which are, one-to-one per person. They offer remote desktop. They offer Azure Virtual Desktop, the latter two being more shared computing. But most certainly, you can use the Microsoft GCC or GCC High environment along with their virtual desktop technologies, so long as you follow the discrete instructions from the CMMC final rule, which are going to say that, in order to keep the device that you're using to access the cloud out of scope, you need to make sure that that device is only allowed to do keyboard, video, and mouse. So you can't do redirection for printing from your cloud PC down to a physical printer. That would be a no-no. If you are doing that, then the device is going to come into scope. You can't store stuff from your cloud PC onto a USB drive or an external hard drive. So there's limitations in the virtual desktop infrastructure use case, just based on the CMMC final rule and delineating at this keyboard, video, mouse, or KVM requirement. But if you meet those, if your use case meets that and you just need a cloud-based PC in a GCC or GCC High environment, that's most certainly a compliant start to an architecture.
That's a really nice carve out that the DoD put, not the DoD, the government put into the 32 CFR rule. Was not in the earlier versions. People asked about it, and it's really nice that they've codified that for us. Very useful.
Okay,
yeah, that was a big question for a long, long time. So we're happy to see it in the final rule, and we think they did a good job with it.
Okay, next question is, for government contractors handling CUI, can your base and frame solutions securely support third-party project management tools such as Procore or other construction management platforms?
So the short answer is yes, and there's a couple of different ways that might happen, right? So if those third-party tools are some on-premise software that you run, that's exactly what the Frame offering is, right? It's Microsoft Azure cloud hosting of a dedicated application that you own. That's just yours, right? It's not a cloud product, but a product you buy some licensing for. And we have pretty broad level to support hosting pretty much any enterprise software that you would need to host. The only exception would be if for some reason it really needs to be on-prem, but we're seeing very, very little requirement for that these days. Most things will run in the Azure environment, and we can host it and manage it in our Frame. The other alternative is that the tool that you want to use, the third-party tool, is a cloud tool, a SaaS tool, software as a service tool supplied by some third party. And the answer is yes, we can definitely incorporate that into those base and frame, but it needs to meet the requirements of the government to be FedRAMP moderate, authorized, or equivalent if it's a cloud. So if the tool you want to use is serving the government contracting market, they may have done that. If they're not, if they're serving more the commercial construction market, then perhaps they have not. And that's something that we can't fix, but frankly, nobody can fix, right? So if they're a cloud provider, running a SaaS product that's not available in an on-prem version, so the only option is the SaaS product, and they've not made it FedRAMP compliant, then you really can't choose it. You can't put any CUI in it. I'll say it that way. You can't use it with CUI. So you need to talk to the vendor about them moving in that direction. But other than that exception, most of these products we can support pretty well, third-party products.
Great question, by the way.
I think we got time for one last question here. Within level 2, what guidelines will the government use to determine if technical information requires the C3PAO external assessment or self-assessment? What process should contractors use to determine which type of level 2 they should obtain?
They're not sharing that with us.
It's a
They're
magic
getting
Right.
trained on that as we speak.
So they using, I mean, just generically sensitivity, right? But mission criticality, how important is this data to national security? I mean, these are the generic kind of things we've heard them talk about, but it's the government's decision, and it's not something that they've put out any formal guidance. So we don't know what to expect. You can have conversations on a contract by contract basis with the government representatives. That would be my suggestion. There's
Yep.
no like published guideline that says here's the categories that are going to be one thing and here's the categories going to be another. The other thing I'll say is we just got a minute or so left. The government has indicated that this is a slider they intend to move, right? So in phase 1, very big emphasis on self-assessment because the ecosystem is not fully built out yet. There's a backlog, or there's not that many people that can do C3PAO assessments. They're still training and building those teams of people. So there's just not enough to do all of the DIB in the first year. So they're doing the phased rollout, but they have indicated that a contract that might allow self-assessment in phase 1, as they move to future phases, they may up the ante and require a C3PAO. They've said that long term, they expect most of the assessments to be C3PAO assessments. So it's a moving scale, and the government decides is the short answer.
Yeah, the CMMC, well, the management office is going to make that call. And I think a lot of the contracting office representatives are, still getting trained to understand what,
Yeah.
how to do this.
That's
But
right. You may not get a very good answer, and
Yep.
that answer may change. So yeah, it's. I think a lot of companies we're seeing that don't know and have bid on a lot of different kinds of contracts with a lot of different kinds of data, they're just going to the C3PAO assessment. It is voluntary, but it's a safe place to be. So there's some additional costs associated with that, obviously, versus a self-assessment. But if your business is at risk, if you end up having the wrong kind, you want to make sure you're ready to bid on any contract that comes down the pike. Go that way. We've seen companies that are really looking already at level 3 and what they might need to do to get there. That's a much smaller percentage of companies, so I'm not suggesting it, just saying that we have heard people talking about it already. I don't. So yeah, it's not something you can be certain of. I'll say that.
All right, we have reached the top of the hour, so that will conclude our webinar. I'm going to thank Megan, David, and Ed for their time today. Great information, great answers to these many questions that we received. If you have any additional questions or comments for Megan, David, or Ed, you can certainly contact them using those email addresses on your screen. As I mentioned early on in the webinar, we will be sharing a copy of the webinar recording and presentation slides in the coming days, so just keep an eye out for that email coming soon. And again, if you have any questions about NeoSystems, about base and frame, or anything else, we're happy to have a conversation with you to talk more about that. So again, thank you for attending today, and have a great afternoon. Goodbye.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.